further ado, welcome Cat Vincent.
Oh. Thank you all very much. As John said, I'm a magician. No matter what you call people like me in various cultures, shaman, root worker, cunning man, there's a phrase which crops up time and time again. We're described as people with a foot in two worlds. One of those worlds, of course, is quotidian reality, the here and now, where we have to pay bills and clean the loo just like anybody else. The other world has many names in other cultures too, Tien and Og, the astral plane and such. One useful term for it, coined a few years ago by Alan Moore, is idea space. Idea space, Alan says, and I won't attempt to do his voice, a space in which mental events can be said to occur, which is perhaps universal. Our individual consciousnesses have access to this vast universal space, just as we have individual houses, but the streets outside the front door belong to everybody. It's almost as if ideas are pre-existing forms within this space. The land masses that might exist in this mind space would be composed entirely of ideas, of concepts, that instead of continents or islands, you might have large belief systems, philosophies, religions. Whatever you call it, that other world, it's a damned hard place to describe, if place is even a useful word here. To a great degree, we simply do not have the language to do so, and so we have to rely on metaphor and myth. Magicians are, in essence, people who find or make a set of such metaphors as a pattern to try and comprehend this essentially numinous other, communicate with it, and try to use that knowledge in the rest of reality. It has no name, so I call it Tao, and a whole bunch of other crude descriptors on top of that. Whatever the hell is going on, this otherness is at least partly imaginal. Often the things which appear to be or act like entities within it, gods, angels, demons, take on very familiar forms to the observer. Something dwells there, and we cannot remain there long. Sometimes its inhabitants come from these old myths and legends. Sometimes, especially to the more modern practitioners, they can appear as fictional entities. Odd as that may seem, it's not that big a stretch if the appearance of idea space inhabitants is a mediated thing, the code running underneath our personal desktop settings. There's now a whole section of pop culture belief systems, sometimes known as hyper-real religions. Whether pure metaphors or manifestations of hyperspace, their influence grows, especially amongst marginalised Americans living in strictly Christian areas. We use the tools at hand to attempt to comprehend and engage with the other world. But the effect of being partly connected or occupied or translated into that otherness is to make the overlaps with this real world decidedly blurry. We magicians live in the Borderlands, and the view from here is as subjective, tricksy, and in its own way real as the other world, although perhaps a little easier to point towards. Those Borderlands, in fact, can be summed up in a single word: liminality. The Wikipedia entry on liminality isn't too bad. They define it as the quality of ambiguity or disorientation that occurs in the middle stage of rituals, where participants no longer hold their pre-ritual status, but have not yet begun the transition to the status they will hold when the ritual is complete. It's specifically a threshold state, and much of magic is concerned with finding places and situations which can induce it. The magician becomes sensitive to these liminal spots, the place Stephen King in the Dark Tower series calls thinnies, where the other world is just that little bit closer. Many see these spots in the rural environment. A lot of paganism is about valorising such spaces. And they unquestionably have their power. I even got the image of one such ancient place, the White Horse of Uffington, tattooed on my arm just last Thursday. But personally, I've mostly found these places in back alleys, building sites, the sides of railway tracks. A classic, of course, is the crossroads, beloved of many cultures, and noted in Hoodoo as the place where you can sell your soul, or perhaps upgrade it. In other words, places that natives of my adoptive home of Yorkshire call neither Nout nor Summit. Those places have a peculiar quality to them which is not quite the same as either of its parts. I've come to associate many of these places with the presence of the ubiquitous urban flower, the buddleia. Known as the bomb site flower for its rapid appearance on sites devastated by the Blitz, its remarkable tenacity is often to be found precisely in the areas that an urban shaman seeks out. I see it as the national flower of the Borderlands. Think of these sites as a meniscus, the touching point between air and water, a place that is both as delicate as a petal and strong enough to hit you like a brick wall if you land on it badly. Whole ecosystems of microscopic plants and tiny animals live on the meniscus, evolved to thrive in this most basic of borderlands. These natural meeting points have always called to us. The sunrise and sunset, those richly liminal times the Scottish call by the lovely name of the gloaming. The seashore, whose hissing song soothes and summons us both. The crossing points between the civilised and the wilderness that were once called the Pale. The transition point beyond which were monsters, which were, and still are, patrolled and negotiated with by the Cunning Folk. And of course the places where the counterculture and the demimonde thrive are also borderlands. Places like the Liberty of the Clink, as it was known in Shakespeare's day, south of the river, at this time of night, in what is now Southwark, the kind of place that actors and whores, the drug dealers and black marketeers and other ne'er-do-wells inhabit, is always the place where the most vivid art, the most controversial science, the most tricky of tricksters, and the loneliest of outcasts can call home. Southwark's a splendid example. The revival of the spirit of the place under the inspired care of the poet John Constable, known also as the shaman John Crow, is both a memorial for those who lived and died out there in the Pale, and a testament to their continuing spirit. If you're free on the 23rd of any month, John holds a ritual there for the spirits of the place. The Sufi writer Hakim Bey, author of the classic Taz, Temporary Autonomous Zone, is a big fan of the Borderlands. In his essay Boundary Violations, he writes, "The aesthetic history of capitalism maps out a process of retreat, a withdrawal into the psychic fortress, the drug-free zone, the mall, the planned community, the electronic highway. We design for life without immunity, believing that only capital can save us from infection. We design, for life without immunity. And as we watch history unfold for us in the media, including the media of cultural and political representation, we become voluntary trance victims of terrorism, the secret inner structure of protectionism. In consequence, our political acts, such as architecture, can express no higher vision than fear. The design of private space is based on the easy antidote to fear, which is boredom. Who will give us an architecture based on the slime mould, the Bedouin tent, the Baroque grotto, and the street festival of, say, an Afro-Brazilian spirit cult? The answer is no one but ourselves. The supreme architect is dead. Long live architecture. The border artists have begun to assemble. The bricoleurs, smugglers, and poetic terrorists of the permeable interface. drawn to the borders, where monoliths rub and creak against each other, whole continents adrift, scraping, shooting sparks, filling the air with orgone and ozone, shifting with millennial dreams, hot, tropically hot, and notoriously unhygienic. This is the region of boundary violations, border raids, penetrations, some pleasurable, others catastrophic, of cross-cultural synergies, ritual brawls, everyday life raised, sublimed to a degree of intensity approaching full presence, full embodiment, and yet indistinct, romantic as a reverie, an erotic dream of a divine utopian landscape, a chaos and a ritual space, the democracy of the mingling of bodily fluids, of polymorphous sensuality, sharing the breakdown of boundaries, the infinitude of passion, the shaping power of desire. One major side effect for those of us whose home is the Borderlands, magicians or otherwise, is that the concept of dualism, of borders themselves, becomes far less hard and fast than it is for most. Taoism, in its classic form, teaches that yin and yang, black and white, order and chaos, or as I once saw it beautifully put, structure and surprise, are separate things which somehow transform from one to the other without ever describing that messy interface between them. But there is a heresy in Taoism, the three-aspect, or Shen, school, which holds that yin and yang are mediated by, essentially, the human soul. That most mysterious and compelling of all Borderlands. The heresy was banished from China and found a home in Japan, where the word Shen was transliterated into Zen. There are no surviving records of the original symbols of Shen Taoism. The only records which do exist are a mutant version of the I Ching, which uses 3 different kinds of lines instead of 2, and a few critical discussions of that heresy. But modern adherents to the Shen school, such as myself, tend to think of Shen as being either grey or, better yet, a rainbow between the static black and white of yin and yang. Another symbol is the revised Daiji, which adds a 3rd portion. Interestingly, this symbol has also been adopted by one of the more vigorous of Borderlands communities, BDSM practitioners. Another way I've looked at this for years is to compare the borders between things, concepts, places, even people, as like that of a cell wall. At the macro level, an organism has to defend itself against intrusion. Breach the wall severely enough, the organism dies. But there has to be diffusion across that semi-permeable membrane Hakim Bey spoke of. There has to be a continual exchange across the boundary state, or the organism will also die. The same is true of any place. Stifle the free flow of information, nutrients and air across the border, and your home will suffocate to death. A recent piece of research notes this. Thousands of endangered migratory animals are at risk of local extinction because of the huge security fences that have been erected around Fortress Europe to keep out refugees. A major study involving researchers from 10 countries has found that nearly 1,800 miles of fencing have been erected across the continent in a rush to strengthen national borders. The researchers say that the new barriers in Europe, plus more than 14,000 miles of fences and walls in the Caucasus and Central Asia, are killing wildlife in huge numbers as they become entangled in razor wire and are cut off from important seasonal habitats. Where borders fell, however, the wildlife saw increased vigour and survivability. Similarly, there is strong historical and archaeological evidence that when a society restricts its borders too heavily, especially to foreign ideas, that society soon decays. is not the talk that I would have given if last Thursday had ended differently. I'm still reeling from the result, and I bet most of you are too. It's an object lesson in many things. The main one for me is a reminder of the awful, terrible lie of purity. The Leavers' votes were bought and sold through an empty myth of a golden age of Britain, where the skies were blue, the grass was green, and the wogs stopped at Calais. A pure, white world. Britain was never a pure, white world, and the shores beyond were never darkest evil. But even in these complex times, that lie is incredibly easy to sell. I see it as a form of future shock. As Alvin Toffler predicted some 50 years ago, the rapid pace of change in the modern world drives a lot of people into fearfully retreating from its complexity, all these new and foreign ideas and realities, into fundamentalist beliefs based on a simple, dualistic, us and them mentality. And has become horribly clear that lie of purity could undo us all. I think the truth is far closer to this. Everywhere is, to one degree or another, the Borderlands. Despite the easy dualisms we've been sold, there's been a clear rise in embracing a spectrum in concepts previously treated as cut and dried. In sexuality and gender, more and more embrace a rainbow of possibilities. The borders between male and female, straight and gay, shifting as a result of the shared experience of the ones in the middle or the ones not on that spectrum at all. The Pulse Club in Orlando was a borderland, and one man who could not handle the contradictions of his soul while being one of its inhabitants wreaked an awful toll. Despite racist and homophobic idiocy, more and more people are mixed race, drawing their strength and identity from all parts of their heritage. My Britain, my Albion, is, and no matter what the fascists try to force it to be, it will always be a mongrel nation. And in the harsh world of climate devastation that we live in, we need all the hybrid vigour we can get. The Yorkshire town I came down from to talk to you tonight is Hebden Bridge. Say no more. 6 months ago yesterday, we received a harsh lesson in how the border between land and water is shifting fast. We mostly survived as a community, and the local resilience has been astonishing to be a part of. We just had an extra Christmas this weekend because the last one got drowned. Our annual handmade parade yesterday told the story of the floods and our recovery in a series of mini Mardi Gras floats. Thousands turned out to watch. One of the many ironies of the flood is that the best barrier against it ever happening again is a soft barrier, allowing for water to move but slowing its pace gradually. But this needs the support of local farmers upland of the valley, who insist that the borders be hard and fast, and that they can burn off all the plants whose roots would slow the flood waters so that rich men can shoot grouse. But I think my mad little town will still endure, because it is, deep in its heart, a borderland. And once you're a dweller of the borderlands, you can't stay in either place alone. The whole point is to carry the knowledge from one to the other, reshaping both. You serve both worlds and live in the liminal space between. And it really doesn't take that much to cross over. For some of us, we do have to push harder, to transgress extravagantly. And for some, it's as simple and profound an act as having a little witch jar hidden in your bedroom in an American flyover state. Your mileage will vary, but the destination is always the same country. The borderlands welcome everyone. They do not judge by any criteria other than needing to be there or not having anywhere else to go. and their laws are very simple. In the midst of all the fear and horror I felt on Friday and ever since, I took some comfort from the myths and legends and stories that are part of my magician's toolkit, the hyper-real beliefs that have shown me truth out of fiction. I'd like to end this with a quote from one of them, the science fiction TV show Babylon 5, created by J. Michael Straczynski. The space station of the title was created as Borderland, a place where humans and aliens could meet, share their cultures, and discuss their differences peacefully. After years of turmoil and war, it achieved most of its purpose. Here are the words of one of its key philosophers, Jakar of Narn. The universe speaks in many languages, but only one voice. It speaks in the language of hope. It speaks in the language of trust. It speaks in the language of strength and the language of compassion. It is the language of the heart and the language of the soul, but it is always the same voice. It is the voice of our ancestors speaking through us, and the voice of our inheritors waiting to be born. It is the small, still voice that says, we are one. No matter the blood, no matter the skin, no matter the world, no matter the star, we are one. No matter the pain, no matter the darkness, no matter the loss, no matter the fear, we are one. Here, gathered together in common cause, we agree to recognise this singular truth and this singular rule, that we must be kind to one another. Because each voice enriches us and ennobles us, and each voice lost diminishes us. We are the voice of the universe, the soul of creation, the fire that will light the way to a better future. We are one. Thank you. Go.
What has been the one story, English story, that has been the one that is encapsulated? Obviously, you're a big fan of science fiction and fantasy like I am.
Yeah.
But the one English story you feel that really has offered you the best access into the Borderland?
Okay, I'll go for it. There were so many. I could have done a whole talk just answering that question. But one I will suggest is one that grabbed me when I was very, very young. And it's an Alan Garner book called Elidor. I don't know if any of you read that one, and most people know Weirdstone and Brisingam, and I think, excellent. But basically, it's about a group of working class kids in the back alleys of Manchester who find a unicorn. So if that's intriguing enough for you, that idea of urban liminality, of the idea that you can reach the other worlds. I know, right? It's a crime this one's not taught in schools. So, I was about 7 or 8 when I read it. So,
Elidor.
Yeah, Elidor. Early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, yeah.
Can you spell that?
Elidor.
So it's prior to the internet and the internet's fascination with...
Yeah, and Alan Garner's having a big... Oh gosh, I used to date a girl from Audley Edge, so I know the area well. Her parents read Weirdstone in manuscript. Yeah, I know, right? And Alan's still going. He's still walking around Audley. He's still deep. He's an old cunning man. Is Alan Garner? I swear to it.
What's the difference between urban magic and non-urban magic?
Good question.
It's urban, Irving. Sorry, mate. I just got to. In terms of energy, to use that horrible old-fashioned energy, man. Raw stuff, there's a kind of a wildness, that sense of it being bucolic, of being terribly green and rooted into the landscape, and very connected with farmers and woods, basically. But yeah, going back to one of the earlier slides, my man John Constantine. It was the great example, again, a creation of Alan Moore's, who was really the first time you ever saw an urban magician in fiction. The idea of someone who was a working class lad from Liverpool originally, then moved to London. But he was able to draw on those same kinds of powers, but with a very distinctly town and city vibe to it. There's a grittiness. It's about brick, not dirt. I think is probably the best way to sum it up.
Really love that Hellblazer, because basically he's kind of like the anti-hero, but he's a hero.
Yes. Hero against his own preferences most of the time.
Basically, he did it himself as well.
Yes.
Which is mostly.
Yeah, he's a dodgy geezer, is John. You don't want to go. I've actually done a couple of street rituals working with John Constantine, effectively in the same form as you would any voodoo lower, particularly in Liverpool. I did a couple of rituals to help the people who were involved in the stage version of Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger, if any of you know that production, which should be revived next year. Keep your eyes out for that one. It's an amazing show. But in Liverpool, there is a part of Matthew Street, which is where the Cavern Club used to be. And on Matthew Street is where Ken Campbell originally staged the play of Wilson's Illuminatus in the mid-70s. At a place called the Liverpool School of Language, Music, Dream and Pun, which was built more or less on the site of the Cavern Club. It was a warehouse. It's a fake Irish theme pub now. But just on the wall of that pub is the bust of C.G. Jung. Because in Jung's Memories, Dreams and Reflections, he had this dream about being in Liverpool, a city he'd never visited before, and he became convinced that it was kind of like the centre of all the ley lines in the world. And later on, Bill Drummond and Julian Cope separately had this same idea. There was this particular manhole in the middle of Matthew Street, which was this essential nexus point for all the chi on the planet. And Drummond did a 24-hour vigil there. Cope busked there for a while. So as part of the ways to try and get funding for Cosmic Trigger, we did a couple of street rituals under the statue of Jung in Matthew Street. And originally when we did this, I suggested to Daisy Campbell, the director of the show, that we draw on John Constantine because he's from Liverpool. Alan Moore had just announced his involvement with the play. He does a video thing where he plays both the supercomputer named Fuck Up and Satan. And Alan had a lot of fun recording that video from the look of it. But so we've done a couple of actual street rituals using John Constantine literally as a titular spirit for street urban magic. So, as I say, sometimes inhabitants of the Borderlands, they take on the faces of the old myths, but they're not averse to using the modern myths either.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.